Our special guest today has been Dr. Erdman, author of Building the Kingdom of God on Earth. It's really an expose of dominion theology, and it's been very interesting so far. Right before we went to break, Dr. Erdman, we were talking about John Foster Dulles and how he was instrumental in really kind of the architect of that type of mentality. But in your book also, you use there's a prominent guy there by the name of Lionel Curtis.
Yes, correct.
What was his role, and why was he so important?
Well, he was a personal friend of John Foster Dulles. He was an Englishman. He was educated at Oxford University, as most Dominionists at the time were educated at. Basically, Oxford University was the hub of the Dominionist movement at the time. And he joined Lord Alfred Milner, the High Commissioner, the English High Commissioner in South Africa. He joined him as an administrator. And basically, at the turn of the century, they started the so-called Boer War. They basically wanted to get South Africa under British rule. They wanted to incorporate South Africa into the British Empire due to its great mineral wealth, its gold and diamond mines. Cecil Rhodes was also a very influential person, and he was basically the money power behind Lord Alfred Milner. And Milner and Curtis, along with some other administrators, basically succeeded in winning the war and bringing South Africa under British rule. But the important aspect of it is that uniting the different states in South Africa was basically seen as a test case. They wanted to see how well they succeeded in bringing these different states together under British rule, and then use that experience to basically use it as a model to unify all nations under British rule. So basically, they wanted to use the British Empire as their starting point or as their basis to unify all nations, or basically setting up a world government under British rule. And this is really where Lionel Curtis got his start. And then eventually they realized that they had a huge problem because one big nation didn't return back to the British motherland, as they called it.
Yeah.
And that big nation was, as you can guess, was the United States of America.
Right.
They didn't want to return back to the British Empire. They didn't want to be ruled by the British king or queen, whatever. And so they realized that the British Empire was really the greatest impediment to reaching the goal of setting up a world government. And when they basically turned around and destroyed the British Empire single-handedly. The person who came up with the notion of a British Commonwealth was none other but Lionel Curtis. Eventually he became a history professor at Oxford University and came up with the idea of a British Commonwealth. Well, what did they do after they had destroyed the British Empire? Well, they came up with the idea of setting up the League of Nations. And as you may recall from your history lessons, the League of Nations was also promoted in the United States by President Woodrow Wilson.
That's right, yeah, progressive.
Correct.
Yes.
And as you also know, that the American public was not too thrilled about joining the League of Nations. As a matter of fact, the Senate rejected the idea of joining.
Yeah.
And they basically did not sign the Versailles Peace Treaty, did not become a member state under the jurisdiction of the League of Nations. And once again, that idea was basically came to an end because America didn't join. And then these individuals, Lionel Curtis, Philip Kerr, John Foster Dulles, and some of the others came together at Paris during the time of the Versailles Peace Conference and came up with the idea of the United Nations.
Which is what we have today.
Correct.
Now, I think it's interesting when you look at, because when you talk about the United Nations, most nations, if you spell it out for the people and say, you have to, disregard your sovereignty, or there is no sovereignty per country.
Yes.
And if you have to throw that away, most people probably wouldn't be for it. But they never
Correct.
come out and really tell you that. And I thought it was interesting because I was in the military. I got many friends of mine in the military. I've got family who have retired from the military. And now, even the United States, when we wear our beret, there's this little blue patch behind our insignia.
Yes.
And it's basically a United Nations.
Yes.
And that really, I have to admit, as an ex-soldier, that kind of bugs me.
It should.
It really bugs me because basically what that says is that we're in subjection
Yes.
to a foreign body, and our soldiers are put under the authority of foreign governors.
Yes,
and that type of stuff. So, yeah, Woodrow Wilson, the League of Nations, and then progressing, of course, into the United Nations, what it is today, and it actually wields a lot more power than what people think that it does.
Yes, correct. Well, you might be surprised to read some of the early works, like the books John Foster Dulles wrote and published. And you would be surprised. Even Lionel Curtis wrote a very influential book, Civitas Dei. He used the Latin title, meaning the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
And what he meant by this was, as can be known by reading the book, he meant the world government. So kingdom of God was a synonym for world government. Well, you would be surprised if you read some of his early works, like works written in the 20s and 30s, to know that they were extremely explicit in spelling out their ideas. They used code words like kingdom of God, but they also used slogans like the New World Order, and they also specified it and defined it as setting up a world government. And then obviously the other side of the coin was to destroy national sovereignty. And they said it.
Yeah.
They wrote it down. They defined it.
Well,
later on,
go ahead.
Later on, they were more muted, more careful in spelling out what they really wanted to do. But in the early works, they were very specific and explicit.
And they wanted to mask it there at the end because, well, when you spell it out, most people aren't going to go for it.
Yeah.
Now, I got a question for you. Now,
Yes.
back in 2000, I remember doing a prophecy update sermon. And USA Today had a headline. This was when the Eurodollar first came. I believe it was the new year. They started it in 2000 using the Eurodollar. But they listed, and I remember the headline. I think it was in USA Today because I took it to church. And the headline said, Old Roman Empire Restored.
Oh, really?
Yes. And they named every nation that was a part of it. And, for the most part, it really was.
Yes.
I mean, does that fall into this dominion type, mindset anywhere? Does it play any part?
Exactly. In my book, Building the Kingdom of God on Earth, I'm only concerned about the time period between 1919, right at the end of the First World War, to 1945, right at the end of the Second World War. I was only concerned about that time period. And I have a very long section in my book just dealing with the European Union, with the unification of the European states. So even prior to the Second World War, they already were very busy trying to come up with some kind of organization which would unite the European states. And yes, it's a vital part of that whole scheme, which we call Dominionism.
Absolutely. So how does Dominionism then affect global policies during the time period that you were writing about?
Well, it was the foremost policy. It was the most vital, most important policy which was being promoted by all the major politicians in the Anglo-Saxon world, primarily. But obviously, Hitler played into that whole scheme also because they needed to have a world war. You know that their line of reasoning went like this. In order to prevent war, we need to destroy the nations. We need to destroy the notion of national sovereignty. And so they needed a world war. They needed someone like Hitler to make that argument plausible. They said, well, if you don't want a war like the First World War, or if you don't want a world war like the Second, well, you need to listen to us. You need to cross boundaries. You need to set up an international community. You need to set up a world government. And only then can we abolish war. Only then can we get rid of that horrible, horrible thing where different nations will war against each other and destroy each other. And this was the argument. But obviously, nowadays, they have different other schemes, like the environmental threat, global warming, and different other scenarios. Well, obviously, the most prevalent and the most domineering theme is the war on terror. So they have substituted some other arguments in regards to how they can justify getting rid of national sovereignty.
Absolutely. Hey, Dr. Urban, I got to take another break. When we come back, I want to focus on two main questions, and that is Dominionism, as far as the global policies, how they are affecting those policies today, and is Israel affected, in a positive or negative way? And then we're going to finish it up by this administration, at least the way you see it here in the government, and is it reflecting any Dominionism, traits in it? But we're going to save those when we get back. Gang, you're listening to the fastest show on radio. My name's Doug Copen. Mr. Jamie Hughes, my special guest today, Dr. Erdman, talking right to us from Switzerland. Don't go away. We'll be back after this.